Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Nikhil Menon, assistant professor of history at the University of Notre Dame, specializing in political and economic history of 20th century India. We discussed his latest book, Planning Democracy: Modern India's Quest for Development. We spoke about how India implemented central planning as a post-colonial democratic republic, the role of P.C. Mahalanobis, or the professor, attempts to increase plant consciousness in India, the role of technocrats, its impact on India's centralized economic system, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi, Nikhil. Thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure. I'm so thrilled that we've been planning, no pun intended, this conversation for months and months, and we finally get to do it.
Thank you so much, Shruti, for having me. Yes, we planned to do this several months ago, but illness came in the way of both of us, and I'm glad that we've finally overcome these hurdles in our planning.
Yes. So the book is just wonderful. You know, in the background is this nation building exercise, this post-colonial nation building exercise that is taking place. In the foreground, it is a question of economic policy at its core. But really, there are two parts to it. One is sort of the ideological lens or the goal, this idea that many of the socialists and the Fabian socialists in the Indian National Congress had, that economic growth is the most important thing that India required as a newborn constitutional republic. And the best way to achieve that, as the mainstream was at that time, is a kind of planning exercise, right? But the second part is the tools or the infrastructure that is required for any country, you know, a developing country or a new country or even an advanced country, to actually execute on the planning exercise. And your book is really focused on the latter. It is talking about how this infrastructure was built out, how it was related to the nation-building exercise. And the protagonist is, of course, the professor, as we like to call him, who is P.C. Mahalanobis. What is a good way of thinking about the tools of planning that were relevant for India, because it was a democracy, which is different than virtually any other place where such an extensive planning exercise was implemented?
Yeah, thanks, Shruti. I mean, the book is about what I think of one of the great experiments of the 20th century, post-colonial India, independent India after centuries of colonial rule, trying to put together two ideas that were considered institutionally and intellectually incompatible. On the one hand, Soviet-inspired economic planning. On the other hand, liberal democracy of the sort of Western sort of parliamentary style. And so the book is not really sort of an attempt to look at whether or not plans worked in terms of, GDP growth, etc., or, per capita growth, but really in terms of how did planning become so central to the idea of modern India and to the story of modern India. And so I do that through the figure of P.C. Mahalanobis, and then I look at how this idea of democratic planning was quite central to the narrative of, early independent Indian nation building. This idea that India is embarking on this new project and that it has something to teach the world as part of its non-alignment, as part of its posture at international institutions, and as part of what the beacon that it shines for newly decolonizing nations. India, of course, was one of the first to decolonize. And so for lots of decolonizing Asia and Africa, this seems as a model by which to navigate the sort of choppy waters of the Cold War by not belonging to either bloc, with, of course, very mixed results, as we know. I mean, it seems amazing today, but planning was once an exciting idea. Planning was once seen as an almost romantic idea. Why is it, for example, that Bollywood films are talking about it? Lata Mangeshkar and Mohammed Rafi are singing songs about Panchvarshiya Yojanas. And so that's what I'm trying to recreate with this book. But now coming to your question about the ideology of planning, and as opposed to the institutions that make it work, I actually made a sort of conscious decision not to delve too much into the ideology of planning, because in some ways I think that is better served by the literature on planning in India. Going back to the 1960s, the works by A.H. Hansen, to then later on to Partha Chatterjee, Medha Kotesia, but even more recent books such as the volume by Cambridge University Press and the Planning Commission from last year, in which you yourself have an essay on the origins of the Planning Commission, the intellectual origins, ideological origins of it. But just to summarize for those listening, I would say that the ingredients or the strands that I think of as most important for planning were one, the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which sort of provides a spark for Asian nations of what an Asian nation could do, what a sort of centralized government, when with everything sort of, going in concert, could achieve. Then there is the sort of Fabian socialism that you alluded to from the late 19th century. The Fabians were, of course, a kind of Marxist group that believed in a sort of gradualist Marxism or a democratic socialism. And it included people like Sidney Webb, Beatrice Webb, Harold Lasky, major intellectuals of the late 19th and early 20th century, and all of whom influenced, for the purposes of India, the reason they're relevant is that they influenced a very important cohort of Indians, including Ambedkar, including Nehru, including Krishna Menon, and several others who were at Cambridge and the LSE at the time. But apart from that, of course, there is the influence of Marxism, straight up Marxism, and the Soviet Union with its own 5-year plans in the 1920s, the New Deal in America under FDR, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which is also providing a model of what a avowedly non-communist capitalist country but can do in terms of state-led growth as well. And aside from that, there is the Second World War, which in some ways is a global planning moment in which, whether you're communist or not, whether you're Axis or Allied, the state is directing so much of the resources, whether in America, England, Germany, Italy. So much so that by 1945, the Labour Manifesto in England talks about the Labour Party believing in a planned economy. And so in some ways, even the country that had colonized India, believed in a planned economy. So I think that those are some of the ideological elements that go into planning. But I'd say that the Nehru government was ideological about planning, but it was not doctrinaire. And I say so partly because this is something that Nehru would sort of constantly return to in his letters when, for example, he got barbs from the left, from the Communist Party, saying, well, if you believe in planning, shouldn't you be doing this and that? And he would say that, well, we don't believe in planning or socialism in a doctrinaire manner. We believe it in the way in which it sort of organically fits our conditions. And his obsession and the Nehru government's obsession really, including that of Mahalanobis, was industrialization. And this is something the economists with him also allude to. Whether you look at the writings of J.J. Anjaria, I.G. Patel, people who went on to, careers that were not necessarily socialistic in any sense. I.G. Patel, of course, went on to, lead the IIM Ahmedabad, LSE, etc. They all say that Nehru's obsession was industrialization. And in a sense, the socialism was a means to an end. And also in terms of ideology, I think it's curious to note that socialism itself in early independent India is this kind of shape-shifting ideology.
Exactly. They can't agree on what it is.
Exactly. But I think that part of it is artful as well, right? Part of it is that you just feel like there's a confusion about what socialism is. But part of it, I think, is for a generation that had actually read, like Nehru has read, Das Kapital by Marx, etc. Part of it, I think, is an artful framing by which you can have people from the communist parties, people from the Praja Socialist parties, people from the Congress, people from even the Jansangh, all claiming to be socialist, right? And so when in the Avadi Congress in 1955, when the Congress Party declares the socialist pattern of society to be the goal for India, and then the parliament adopts it the next year, there's not very much opposition, except for, very minority opposition. It's because everybody describes themselves as a kind of socialist.
Yeah, and this comes up in Constituent Assembly debates. There's a question of whether they should include socialist, the word socialist in the preamble. And everyone agrees that they are socialist and it's a good idea, but none of them agree upon exactly what it means. So on a very sort of technical point, it is left out. Of course, it's brought in later in the 42nd Amendment by Indira Gandhi and so on. So now it does find itself in the preamble. But you're absolutely right. It's that they're all socialist, but to all of them, the goals are similar, but the means or the planning aspect of it means quite different things. In fact, each one of them come up with their own plans, which you talk about.
Yeah, and I think that this one stark departure from that is, from the late 1950s onwards, sort of liberal conservatism. It seems a sort of contradiction in terms of, but the liberal economic vision and a sort of social conservative vision of people like Rajaji with the Swatantra Party. That is diametrically opposed to all kinds of socialism. And it includes people who are former socialists, like Menon Masani, somebody that you've written about as well. But in the early 1950s, socialism is an umbrella term. It's a very crowded space underneath that umbrella because everybody claims to be a socialist. And as Sudipta Kaviraj says, it leads to this kind of confusion about what socialism itself means at that time.
You spend a lot of time in the book, and that part is just delicious to read. Like, the kinds of efforts that were made to legitimize the planning exercise and the 5-year plan specifically in public consciousness, to sort of publicize these ideas, to make sure that they get some kind of legitimacy. But given that socialism was so much in the air, I guess one of the questions that I was thinking about is, why did it need to be legitimized? Or was it because this was mostly an intellectual movement that, most Indians, and this was a very agrarian economy, most people were not literate. So is that one of the reasons that, this needs to be legitimized in public consciousness? Is it because there is a continuation from British war controls and price controls and quantity controls? So there is a kind of reminiscence of things that happened after 1939. And now that you're continuing the same policies after, 1950, is there an effort to Indianize this and, kind of break from the colonial moment? Is it because they're worried about the spreading sort of, communism? There are two states which have democratically elected communist parties to represent them in government. So why is there this burning need to legitimize these plans? Because to me, it seems like there was so much buy-in, but then I'm only reading sort of, the English elite literature.
Right. I mean, I think that's a great question. And in some ways, the whole second half of my book is sort of dedicated to trying to grapple with this idea of, planning we think of as this entirely technocratic exercise, and there's good reason why most scholars have focused on that. But what I was surprised by is how much effort, time, and government and public money is spent for at least 2 decades on trying to convince Indians to become, as the term went, plan conscious, to convince people to participate in the plans. And I think there are many reasons for it. I mean, some of which you alluded to, and I think that those all go into the kind of factor mix. So one is that there is definitely, certainly in the 50s and the 60s at least, and after that it sort of wanes, as with many other things, there's an idealism. This is a generation of politicians, again, from right to left, a generation of politicians who have spent much of their professional lives and their youths fighting in this national struggle, in this struggle against colonialism. And there's a belief that people can participate, that you can exhort people to do things that are not necessarily in their material interest. And there's a conception of what this new democracy will be. There's a conception that it needs to be participatory, and that citizenship, and this is something that Nirja Gopal Jayal has written about in her book on Indian citizenship, that Indian citizenship was meant to be something in which you got the fruits of citizenship, such as liberty, etc. But it came with obligations. It came with responsibilities, especially in a poor country like India. And those responsibilities included doing things such as, I interpret, this is not Nirja Gopal Jayal, but in my interpretation, what her analysis suggests is that one of the obligations of the citizenry is to participate in national development goals. Not necessarily government policies, but national development goals. And because planning becomes so closely fused with national development, in a sense, it's an exhortation to the Indian public to participate in this goal of national development. The idea being that we've struggled, we've got independence, you're now independent Indian citizens, but the struggle doesn't end there. We're overwhelmingly, as you said, agrarian, overwhelmingly illiterate, overwhelmingly poor. We depend on most countries for foreign aid, but you can participate in this goal of national development. And so that's why I think that the term plan consciousness was used as opposed to, say, class consciousness, which a more Marxist theory would advocate. Because plan consciousness allows everyone to participate, right? It's a sort of, it allows you to have like a sort of a vertical line of identity as opposed to a lateral line that cleaves populations apart from each other, as opposed to class, caste, etc., religion, identity, linguistic identity. Plan consciousness is something that the mill owner and the proletariat and the agricultural laborer, everyone can theoretically have plan consciousness. There's this idealism that is certainly prevalent in certain parts of the government, and Nehru certainly, having spent a lot of time in his writings, he certainly subscribes to this. But apart from this idealism, there's also, I think, some realpolitik going on. There's a recognition of extremely low state capacity, and there's a recognition that, all these highfalutin plans that we had, especially with the second five-year plan, they're just not going to work, especially at a time in which we have this kind of dollar squeeze, we don't have foreign exchange. And one of the ways the savings rate is low, and one of the ways in which we can do it, is to have people voluntarily contribute to it. Right? That without recourse to wage payments is one of the phrases that I found in the plan documents. And so you have people contributing to laying, embankments, to laying roads, to building dispensaries and hospitals without getting any payment. And that's part of this plan consciousness. And thirdly, I think it's also a part of just political legitimation, that there is the Congress party realizes that if it wants to be popular in the public's eye, fusing itself to development programs, just like in 2022 in the 1950s, is a good way of doing it, right? That if you constantly talk about development, then the common person, the least that they hear about you is that this is what you seem to want to be doing. And so I don't think that you can completely remove electoral considerations from it. But I do think there's a good deal of, as I said, idealism, but also an eye towards low state capacity.
There were times when I was reading the book when I was feeling a bit cynical in the sense that, if you think about another slightly foreign idea, which was brought in wholesale, it is universal adult franchise, right? So India is very unique in that at the birth of the republic, even though such a large percentage of the population is illiterate, they bring in universal adult franchise, very similar to the kind of beautiful narrative you've painted for us on how this happens. Ornit Shani has this fantastic book on how, India really became democratic. Ram Guha has written about, how elephants were sent to, really far-flung places deep inside the forest, and Sukumar Sen was trying to get, India to vote. The interesting thing is, even though that was a bit alien and there was a lot of publicizing and propaganda that happened by all political parties, not just the Indian National Congress or the government, this idea of constantly selling India as a democracy, it went away. We didn't have to sell it. People took to it quite naturally. It worked wonderfully. India has had sort of a continuous, except for a 22-month period and, president's rule in many border states. Unfortunately, it's had a very good record of, holding elections, very high voter turnouts. So it's not that in the 60s and 70s, enormous government budgets are being spent to publicize the idea of voting or participating in the, democratic endeavor. On the other hand, that's happening for, plan consciousness. Is it because it's just not giving results? That there are still these massive shortages? People are waiting in line. The poor are hungry. Young people cannot get a job. Like everything that was promised to them is simply not coming through. And so is that one of the reasons there needs to be such a huge narrative, which is very much designed around this, Indian nationalist notion of sacrifice? That's another thing that pops up a lot. So, my romantic view is, wow, this was this great nation building exercise. There's this collective consciousness, very much, the Nirja Gopal Jayal story. The cynical economist in me is like, of course they had to publicize this. People were starving. The whole thing is bonkers. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to compare it to a simultaneous experiment in some ways, right, of instituting the adult franchise. I think the two distinguishing features come to mind. One is that India, though universal adult franchise, accepted in toto, is new in the world when India does it. India still had at least some sort of baby steps towards electoral democracy from the early 20th century onwards, right? And so in some ways, Indians are being tutored to the idea of elections with an expanding franchise from the early 20th century. It goes from municipal to provincial, and it's very elite, very male-dominated, etc. But at least the idea is that, and there is part of the decades-long, nationalist campaign is that we will extend the vote to you, and that once you have the vote, things will change. So in some ways, that work that is being done for planning from the 1950s is being done for voting from before itself, right? Which is that an idea is being propagated of people needing to adopt these new political forms, these new political identities, and new political actions in order for the country to move forward. So I'd say that in some ways, elections had that benefit going for it. The other difference is that I think that if we judge the success of electoral democracy just by the fact that elections happened, maybe that is too low a bar when we're comparing it to planning. Because, I suppose the supporter of planning would say, well, 5-year plans were instituted, right? That's the bare minimum that happened. The question would be, substantively, did electoral democracy yield results that helped the Indian citizen in ways in which we would expect the 5-year plans to help Indian citizens? And so, for example, when VDEM Institute looks at Indian democracy today and says it's only an electoral democracy, but it's not really a democracy in substantive aspects, I would say that that would be more, to my mind, the like-for-like comparison, which is that, so if in the first 10 years we have 4% growth as opposed to, 1% growth between 1900 and 1950, that is maybe some appreciable growth, which is bad compared to the 1970s, where it's much less and you should be doing more. So how do you compare that? What is the like-for-like comparison with electoral democracy? Not just that people have the vote, but are the aspirations of the people when they go to the electoral booth being translated by the political class that they're voting into power?
for me, the question was more about, do they buy into it? Not so much the outcome. So, for instance, Rohit, has this wonderful book, A People's Constitution. Again, the Constitution was a project that was a very elite project, right? I mean, a large part of the assembly is chosen through the elections that happened in 1946. The provincial elections, but that is on a very limited franchise, right? So this is very much the elite. The assembly is cognizant of the fact that it is an elite and, keeps the amendment provisions fairly easy so that once there's universal franchise, people can actually change things in the constitution. And yet, the moment you have the post-constitutional moment, Rohit describes wonderfully how this is no longer an elite enterprise. It is regular folks, right? Butchers and prostitutes and, cotton sellers and, ordinary businessmen who have taken the idea that these rights are now guaranteed to them very seriously and run with it. Right? So in a sense, we do have a constitutional consciousness, at least that's what I learned from Rohit's book. So I'm curious about, we have a democratic consciousness, maybe it doesn't give us the outcome. We have a constitutional consciousness, though it may not extend to everyone, like for instance, in tribal regions. So I'm not suggesting it's universal. But it seems like a lot of effort has to be made for a planned consciousness, right? I think that's where I was going with it. I agree with you that the outcome is different and they're not an apples to apples comparison. But for me, it's also like, why do they even need to legitimize this? Everything that needed to be legitimized, people just picked it up and ran with it, right?
I think you're right to say that the democratic consciousness and certainly a constitutional consciousness is more readily accepted. Again, not as readily accepted or not in the way that, say, Ambedkar in his last Constituent Assembly debate would talk about Indians having a constitutional morality. Not in that way, at least in the formal modes of participating in a constitutional democracy, of, taking up the vote, participating in elections, filing, public interest petitions, petitioning the court in the way that Rohit's book talks about. So that is definitely true. And I think that part of it, is just, as I think you are suggesting, is just that plans are somewhat more alien to people than the idea that you can vote and you can get somebody to represent you. That I think idea it's alien in its form. Perhaps, we take it from other parts of the world. But I think the idea that you can have someone represent you and your interests, I think comes more easily to people than the idea of a plan, which is a kind of technocratic body that, tells you from high on up above what will be best for you in your village. And I think it is also, for that reason, less empowering than the vote. In some ways, what it's telling you is that you can have plan consciousness, but we don't really want your input on what the plans should be, right? Though, as I point out, there are efforts made, or at least there is the fig leaf of it trying to be a sort of two-way dialogue between the people and the planners. And I refer to, experiments like the planning forums in colleges and in universities. St. Stephen's College still has something called the Planning Forum, which I think most people today don't know, but was set up in the 1950s along with many other colleges and universities across the country as a way for people to debate the different 5-year plans and aspects of it. And the idea, again, filled with this kind of romantic ideals of students will debate these ideas, presumably in different colleges of Delhi University and Madras University and elsewhere. And then the best ideas will filter up to the Yojana Bhavan, and then they will, possibly take on board the best ideas. Of course, none of that happened. But I think that gives you a sense of how distant the idea of planning as an empowering mechanism is. But on the other hand, you do wonder, it is alien, but at the same time, why is it that, Lata Mangeshkar is singing in 1956 a chorus that goes, Kamyab hum karke rahenge 5 saal ke plan ko. Why is it that sadhus are taking up the plan and sort of combining it with, a Ramayana and Mahabharata, again, to ends that in the end would blow up in the Congress's face. But there is a way in which it does filter. But it is, as you say, much more forced. It doesn't happen quite as organically.
Now that you mentioned Lata Mangeshkar and Dilip Kumar and the sadhus, those parts of the book are just so fun to read. And I'm a big Bollywood buff, especially, the 50s, 60s. So I've picked up when these things come up in songs or in the odd movie. The sadhus, I just absolutely had no idea about it. And how much of the Hindu right wing at the time also kind of bubbled up from socialism. So, we have this kind of technocratic socialism, the Mahalanobis 5-year plan kind. We have a Gandhian socialism, which, Jayaprakash Narayan and that wing has been, thinking through for a long time. Of course, it peaks
Kripalani,
during the emergency, Kripalani, etc. And then we have this, sort of Hindu Mahasabha socialism ish thing. I don't know what else to call it, which is a very different kind of socialism. And to me, the most bizarre thing about the sadhus, and I think you point this out, is they are supposed to be past any kind of, material attachment. And, they're not the prototypical person to worry about economic growth and material well-being and modernization. Quite the contrary. Talk to me about these sadhus and what is this bizarre thing going on in India?
Right. So, I found this also bizarre and completely surprising, and I didn't know anything about it. And so when sadhus started turning up in these archival papers I was looking at, I felt like I had to, tug on that string. And so what happens is this, to give, again, your listeners some idea. In early 1956, there's a meeting at Birla Mandir, this Hindu temple in Delhi, between 50 sadhus, Hindu ascetics, and members of the Nehru government, including ministers and including the then Minister of Planning, a longtime Gandhian, Gulzarilal Nanda. Gulzarilal Nanda, was a trade unionist who then sort of taught economics for a bit in Bombay, was a Gandhian, was, very well respected in the Congress and outside for being, extremely upstanding, abstemious, personally, unimpeachable in his morality, but also an extremely devout Hindu and a believer in many spiritual causes and in some also, I would say, some kind of obscure causes as well. And so this is one of them in which Gulzarilal Nanda is meeting with these sadhus in 1956 at this meeting, and it's a meeting that has been set up by the sadhus and Gulzarilal Nanda. Curiously enough, Nehru doesn't have very much to do with it, and it's a program that really has the backing within the Congress of Gulzarilal Nanda and the President of India, Rajendra Prasad. Rajendra Prasad, you'll remember, is also somebody who shares this kind of very Hindu conservatism, but a long-time stalwart of the Congress party, somebody that Nehru was in two minds about becoming the President of India, somebody that Nehru really disapproved of the fact that Rajendra Prasad was present at the inauguration of the Somnath temple, believing not that the Somnath temple should not be rebuilt, but that doing so by the President of India right after partition was, reopening those wounds, given that Somnath had been sort of raided by medieval Muslim looters like Muhammad al-Ghazni. And so both Rajendra Prasad and Gulzarilal Nanda are behind this venture, and the venture is to set up an organization called the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, or the Indian Society of Ascetics. And the explicit charter for this organization is for the sadhus to help with the propagation of the 5-year plans. And as you said, it just seems quite mad because sadhus are meant to have given up a material life, right? They're meant to have gone beyond the material sphere into the spiritual sphere. But as Gulzarilal Nanda says in one of the meetings, actually the sadhus can help be a bridge between the material and the spiritual, between the lok and the parlok, as he says. And so to him, the problem with Nehruvian planning, the problem with Nehruvian socialism, the problem with people like Nehru and Mahalanobis is that they did not understand the ways in which the ordinary Indian would understand these ideas and the idioms and the language in which these ideas may best be communicated to the ordinary Indian. And to him, that idea needed to include religion. There was no way to go around religion. And the way to do it is to include sadhus. And interestingly, Nehru is extremely ambivalent about this. In his writings between Nehru and Nanda, Nehru keeps sort of hemming and hawing, saying, do we really need to do this? Can we really trust these sadhus? Of course, at the time, if you read the newspapers in Delhi at the time, the newspapers don't have a very bright view of the sadhus. They talk about how sadhus are implicated in all kinds of criminal cases, including kidnapping, molesting women, kidnapping children. And so, in this kind of humorous episode, when Nehru is finally convinced by his minister to address a gathering of these sadhus, Nehru is literally scolding them. He's saying that you guys are rascals. In some of his writings, he refers to them as scoundrels. He said that some of you are, of course, great human beings, but some of you are barely worth being called human beings because some of you are engaged in this kind of pretending to be a sadhu, but using it as a guise for all kind of criminal activities. He says it's actually very hard to know who the real sadhu is from fake sadhus, which leads to another sort of very humorous enterprise in which the sadhus form a kind of registration drive by which the Bharat Sadhu Samaj is now handing out identity cards.
Yeah, they are card-carrying sadhus.
Exactly. So you become a card-carrying sadhu, which again is sort of ridiculous because you think of these men who are usually sometimes close to naked, who have no material possessions, but they're supposed to carry a card saying that I'm a member of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj. I was reminded of this recently when I was at the National Archives, when I confronted a similar situation where I was registering in for the day at the National Archives. A man who obviously looked like a sadhu also wanted to go into the National Archives. And the question that is asked of anyone who's registering is, ID the cow. And, they want to see an ID. And of course, the man who came with him said that, ye Baba hai, he's a Baba, he's a sadhu, he doesn't have ID. They wanted an Aadhaar or they wanted a driver's license. And so it put me in mind of this Bharat Sadhu Samaj, which, at a time was actually giving identity cards and might have been able to help this poor gentleman who was next to me. And so it leads to this strange situation where at Kumbh Melas, the Bharat Sadhu Samaj has a pandal, has its own sort of shamiana where they are trying to meld the language of the Panchvarsha Yojana of the 5-year plans with that of ancient Indian Hindu epics like the Ramayana, the Mahabharata. They're trying to include Bhagwan Ram in the ideas of the Dvitiya Panchvarsha Yojana. And so it leads to things that you really would not associate the 5-year plan with.
And austerity. That's an important bridge, right? The austerity part that you must sacrifice and build on the savings rate. This can't be a capitalist material economy. There's an element of sacrifice. So it's bizarre how they connect.
Exactly. And in some ways, you're right. They find an organic link point, and that link seems to be that moral improvement involves sacrifice. And so as part of this Bharat Sadhu Samaj, they also, of course, propagating against drinking alcohol, against eating meat. But at the same time, they're saying part of this moral improvement is also saving according to what the second 5-year plan wants you to, investing in the national bond as opposed to buying jewelry. Exactly. All these things are all seen as part of this, savings, this sacrificial ethic that is required to be a better Indian citizen / in brackets also perhaps a Hindu as well, right? And so the median citizen is a median Hindu. And it leads to eventually, of course, to the Sadhu Samaj allying itself with causes that would come to be to the detriment of the Congress party. As I go into the book, it would ally itself with the VHP. One of the founders of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj is one of the founder vice presidents of the VHP. And by the time the Babri Masjid issue is bubbling up, at the same Kumbh Mela pandals of the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, they're basically saying that the mosque should come down at Babri Masjid and a temple should be built there. And so you see this drift from being an organization that was meant to be dedicated to 5-year plans becoming just a Hindu conservative organization.
I want to come back to the Lata Mangeshkar thing just to stick with the very, fun parts of the book, but they're so informative. How much of sort of the Bollywood involvement was, the government elite and the cultural elite having close proximity. So you're all part of the same cultural moment. So you sort of do what the government says. How much of it was forced explicitly or requested? How much of it was paid for? Or how much of it was like an implicit threat? Like, the government is controlling all kinds of things, right? How much raw stock you can buy is limited because you have price and quantity controls. So how much of this is sort of coerced and how much of it is just, this was part of the cultural moment, movies reflect society, and then that's how these things find their way into, these kinds of songs and films and protagonists and so on?
I actually found it curious that I didn't find too much evidence of coercion except for with the films division. So the coercion there is not on Bollywood as we know it, but on, for example, the fact that before any film is screened, as people of our age know, because this, went up till the 1990s, that, before a film is screened, you will have sort of 10 minutes of sermonizing by the government through documentaries. And you might say that actually some of the documentaries I looked at, from the 1950s were actually quite entertaining because they had some, because of the fact that the state was the only outlet for lots of these creative artists, they did work, just like we know Ravi Shankar worked for, All India Radio. Lots of these artists were working for the state. And so you did have some very creative output at the time. But so I'd say that is the sort of this plain old state propaganda aspect, that the films division puts out these documentaries that, might provide some patronage to artists that might not, otherwise be able to make money. Not the Dilip Kumars, not the K. Abbases, not the Lata Mangeshkars, but, there's so many other artists that are looking for employment and they can find employment in doing some time with All India Radio or the films division, which is one of the largest documentary filmmaker in the world at the time. But in terms of Bollywood and these films that I looked at, say, for example, Naya Daur, in which Dilip Kumar is, or Char Dil Char Rahe, in which has Raj Kapoor, Shami Kapoor, Meena Kumari, I think there it is more the aspect that you mentioned, the aspect that this is part of the zeitgeist of the time, that a lot of the artists of that time also belong to IPTA, the Indian Progressive Theatre Movement Association. They come from this world in which many of them perhaps are more to the left of the Congress than the Congress is, right? And so many of them had been part of the socialist movement. Many of them had been part of theatre societies that were deeply, left-wing, if not Marxist. And so, for example, K. Abbas, Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, is a major filmmaker of the 1950s and 60s. In fact, gives Amitabh Bachchan his launch in South Hindustani later on. So a really big filmmaker. He describes his relationship with Nehru, of course, from afar, and they, didn't meet that many times. But he says that when he was a youth, it was his lifelong love affair. That he thinks of Nehru as kind of inspiring figure, sometimes who disappointed him because he's, becomes a politician. But he talks about the first time that he sees Nehru in person is the time that, Nehru's coming to Allahabad. This is before independence. And, he jumps onto a train without a ticket with a friend of his trying to catch a glimpse of this hero who is coming to his town. So there is this aspect of this generation of movie makers and film stars who do think of these people and this ideology as broadly what they agree with. So there's also this rumor, this kind of story that is probably apocryphal of how Dilip Kumar was once, offered 5 lakhs for a film. And that Dilip Kumar said no, instead invested in the national plan loan. But the fact that rumors like this circulate gives you a sense of, right? I mean, the point is not to say that he actually said it, probably not. But the idea that such rumors go around gives you a sense of the time that it's even plausible that someone would think in this way. Plausible that a film star would carry a copy of Yojana, to be a brand ambassador of it. Also, the Chopra family of producers, I also have a quote in the book about how they talk about how Nehruvian socialism was just part of the sort of water that we drank at the time. This is just what we all sort of broadly believed in. And so, I don't know how much, maybe there are episodes of the state intervening, but I didn't come across it. On the contrary, I found essays written by Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, the same director, in Yojana, the magazine that is funded by the government as planned propaganda, in which he has an article titled Nationalize the Cinema. So he's actually arguing for something that is much more radical than what the government wants. He says that actually, all these movies, it's riffraff, there's no high ideals, where, all these movies have these women cavorting and these playing to very base instincts. Instead, we need to have movies that, celebrate national ideals and that we can develop an audience for it. So that's the sort of evidence that I came across, though I'm sure that there are ways in which the government, offered inducements, etc. But for my next project that I'm just doing some research on now, which is on Indian cultural diplomacy and soft power, there you see the way in which Indian film stars and the government interact.
Oh yes, Raj Kapoor and Nargis are sent to the Soviet Union.
And so, for example, you see there the power dynamic is actually quite different. It's actually, I came across letters from ministers writing to Nargis saying, Nargis ji, we heard that you are traveling to the United States. Could you please stop in Turkey on the way? Because we hear that you're known in every village and we will pay for your, fare from the US to Turkey, etc. So the sort of power dynamic there is switched, except when you're a film star who's out of favor. I found also film stars and different artists, famous dancers and musicians writing to the government saying, can I be added to this delegation that is being sent? Because, going abroad was a big deal then and very expensive.
And foreign exchange is controlled, right?
Exactly,
and if you go with the government, then it's a completely different gig than if you go privately.
So in a way, there's a kind of also give and take that's happening in which some artists also using the fact that the government wants to promote these arts abroad.
No, I think you've touched upon something quite fascinating. The reason, again, I had the cynical view is, for instance, Devika Rani and her husband were given very large piece of land, which later ended up, getting contested because after they died, there was an eminent domain question where the state of Karnataka tried to take the land back and so on. We know that whether it's All India Radio or the NFDC, a lot of the people who were in film were given quarters in Delhi. And, these are not exactly quid pro quos, but, quasi many people more recently have talked about how the Padma Awards in themselves, right, are a major, or Rajya Sabha membership, for instance, which is technically supposed to be made by the president, but we know that it's the cabinet, that vets that list and so on. So there is this sort of soft, I don't know if it's a soft carrot or a soft stick, depending on what form it takes, but we have more examples of the soft carrot than the stick that I can think of. The stick I've heard more from, say, newspaper owners, So for instance, when I speak with, old-time journalists like my grandparents' generation, who was first with the Hindustan Times, then with the Hindu, Indian Express, they talk about how it was difficult to critique 5-year plans because you had to go back to the Commerce Ministry the next day to ask for foreign exchange to buy newsprint or for equipment to buy a new camera. And this was a complicated relationship. So yes, you could technically critique people, but there were no investigative journalism pieces on the kinds of corruption that took place at, the Foreign Exchange Control Office or the CCI, the Chief Controller of Imports and Exports. So there is something funky going on there. I think it would be a fascinating project. The reason I also ask is, you don't exactly bring us to the current moment, but you allude, sort of tying a knot with what's happening now, whether it is the end of the Planning Commission and the Niti Aayog or, various other moments. And there is a current saffronization that is happening in Indian culture, right? So some of this it's quite clear that there is the current dispensation, either the government directly or the political parties that are, part of the government who are explicitly paying and requesting people to tweet on their behalf or, supporting certain kinds of movies. Certain kinds of movies are given tax exemption status. We also know that there's a trend of the villain changing a bit. We're doing a lot more historical characters. Historical characters are now taking a modern nationalist view, very modern Indian nationalist view when we're actually talking about Rani Lakshmi Bai, who was had nothing to do with the current Indian moment, was fighting the British for a completely different reason. And all that is now being couched in a new Hindu nationalist flavor. Uday Bhatia has this award-winning piece on how the portrayal of sort of like religious villains and heroes has changed quite a bit. Now, once again, I find myself thinking that not all of it seems forced. Not all of it is paid for. I don't think everyone who's making these movies has sold out. And how much of it is because it's the cultural moment? How much of it is because they think the audience will like it? Because, clearly they're voting for the current dispensation. So probably there's a market for it. So let's cash in on that market. And how much of it is explicit? So is this just something that we're doomed towards, whether it's plan consciousness or Hindu consciousness? Am I reading too much into this longer arc, or do you see some clear parallels?
That's really thought-provoking. So let me sort of first address the sort of corruption question. And yes, I don't go into corruption explicitly, but it does make me think of, for example, when you talked about how newspapers that of people who ran newspapers who said that it was hard to criticize the government on certain aspects because you depend on the government so much. One is that I would say that might be so, but I still think that perhaps newspapers were braver then than today, because if you read the newspapers of the time, they still carry a lot of critical coverage about the second five-year plan, right? So whether it's the Times of India, the Hindustan Times, the Hindu, about, the shortfalls, in the plan targets. The Bharat Sadhu Samaj is a point of, as I make in the book, and I provide many cartoons just mocking Nehru openly, mocking Gulzar Lal Nanda, saying that, they've sort of kind of lost it to engage with these sadhus. Many critical pieces carried by foreign economists, critics from Rajaji, etc. So even if there was that pressure, which I completely believe, at least, I think that we should be proud that at least many of these papers were still, confident enough and independent enough to still carry that, despite the pressure that might have been exerted upon them. And I also think that some of the pressure also comes from where the median opinion lies. And that was brought to mind for me by a quote that I read by P.R. Brahmananda, who you know is one of the sort of famous Bombay School economists, who writes, and I quote in the book, that during the debates for the second five-year plan between 1954 and 55, arguing against the broad ideas of import substitution and the sort of heavy industrialization model that Mahalanobis was propagating, that the reason there was only one dissent by B.R. Shenoy famously, and the reason that Brahmananda himself did not file a formal dissent, is because it was seen as almost anti-national. And that's the phrase he uses, that it was seen as almost anti-national.
Exactly. When I read
be against it.
That in the book, that's exactly what made me think about the current moment.
Right. And I think that it's not necessarily pressure that's always coming from the government, because again, in the footnotes to that very same anecdote, I write that Brahmananda also in that same interview writes that it was not Mahalanobis who was doing this, because he said that he had actually a very friendly almost sort of exchange of correspondence with Mahalanobis, and he thought that Mahalanobis was actually quite open to his ideas, and actually he describes him as a brilliant man with fresh ideas. So it's not necessarily coming from the government, but it's this general sense that you will be attacked as being hopelessly right-wing, as being reactionary if you are against the five-year plan. I find it quite instructive when people that we now associate as critics of five-year plans write about what they thought of at the time. So when you look at Jagdish Bhagwati and what he writes about the five-year plans, he writes about how he was swept up in the moment in the 1950s and early 1960s. Manmohan Singh also says that, and Bhagwati says that I had drunk the Kool-Aid. To be against import substitution was to be hopelessly right-wing. And so I think that you get the idea that if someone like Jagdish Bhagwati, who today we associate with a very different kind of economics, could himself feel that, you get a sense of how mainstream the idea was. And as I.G. Patel says that the basic idea of the Second Five-Year Plan came to be fused with a kind of anti-colonial nationalism. The idea that this is what we've longed to do for decades while fighting for independence, and we finally are getting a way to do it. And to argue against import substitution seemed like arguing, to some who were extremely intolerant, seemed like an argument almost for neo-colonialism, to allow these Western powers to once again take a foothold. And many of these people, of course, changed their minds later. And as Jagdish Bhagwati says that, perhaps one of the unfortunate thing for India was to have brilliant economists, that India's curse was having brilliant economists.
Yes and no. So I'll tell you where I am on the professional economists as a community. So there are two things simultaneously going on. So one is, of course, you're right. There's a median individual, there's the median news article, and then there's the median economist. And then where do you line these things? And the moment you're too far from that median representative person, you get labeled in a particular way. So, that I completely understand, and it may not be a malevolent action from the state. But on the other hand, there is something going on, even if it's not deliberate, with the government control on higher education, right? All the original statistical departments are very much set up with the idea that they will execute on the survey methods of Mahalanobis. In fact, he's the one who helped set them up. Every single economics department in the country is supposed to produce people who can help with the plan. So they are not designed for a kind of intellectual freedom or a sort of fertile environment where a lot of criticism can come. So I'm not saying they were designed such that there could be no criticism, but it was quite clearly designed for a particular purpose. We were supposed to produce, geography graduates for surveying, when we had the British colonial government, right? Because that's how they collect, land taxes. We're supposed to produce statisticians, and we need X number of statisticians for the plan. We need Y number of engineers for the plan, right? For heavy industry. So there is a kind of groupthink which is happening because the government is in control of higher education in a way that doesn't happen, let's say, in the UK. Right? Where even though in the 50s there's this major planning ideology, I have personally written about how economics has completely moved away from laissez-faire, at the turn of the century and so on. But because Oxford and Cambridge are, they existed so long before the planning moment came or before the Labour Party, got into power post-World War II, of course there are people who are in favor of the plan, but there are welfare economists, there are Keynesian economists, there are Fabian economists, and there are out-and-out people working on sort of like Leontief input-output matrices. And there is a healthy debate. And it is no surprise that when many of these economists left to go get an education abroad, it's not that they diametrically changed their mind, but they do start getting exposed to new ideas. And when I was a student at Delhi University, which was not that long ago, it was post-liberalization, this is 2001 to 2004, in our comparative economics system syllabus, for instance, I didn't know it was called the socialist calculation debate, by the way. I didn't know there were two sides to the debate. We only read Langa and Lerner. We didn't read Hayek and Mises. And I remember when I came to graduate school, one of my colleagues now and my dissertation advisor, Peter Betke at the George Mason department asked me, how do you know this Langa Lerner stuff so well? And I was like, that's all I know. Mises was in a footnote in one of those papers that we read. So there is a certain groupthink that is happening, maybe not because they want to control expression, but because they are, again, planning to produce economists for a very specific purpose. And there is a loss in, an intellectual culture in economics because of it. And the moment we start liberalizing and economists start going abroad, you see a big switch taking place.
If I may sort of offer a sort of an alternate reading of this, maybe from my sort of disciplinary lens on this, I think that in my reading of the sources, it didn't seem like there was that level of groupthink necessarily because of an education that was in a sort of propagandistically way trying to do that. By which I mean that there is much less justification for you not to have been taught other schools of economics in 1990 as opposed to in 1950, when the median position in economics has changed, right? Whereas in the 1950s, I was just looking at some quotes that I came across. I was surprised, and these are figures that you and your audience will know. Lionel Robbins, no friend of socialists, says that planning, unfortunately, is, quote, the grand panacea of our age, and that decolonization and planning are seen as structurally reinforcing each other. That this is the problem in these decolonizing countries, that they think of planning as automatically being the right thing to do. And Peter Bauer, again, no friend of socialist economics, also says that the problem with the second five-year plan was not that India was a kind of oddball off on its own, but that second five-year plan largely reflected the then dominant opinion of Western development economists and that of current economic orthodoxy amongst development institutions in the West. So I would say that in some ways it's not that Indian education is producing, but that there is like a global zeitgeist in which this is seen even within development economics, which is then a fledgling discipline by itself, that in that discipline at this time, this is seen as what is appropriate for poor decolonizing nations. And it's why I think that you have people who, in a sense, recant, right? People who change their mind on these ideas, but still up to the 1960s have these ideas like Manmohan Singh, like Jagdish Bhagwati, Suresh Tendulkar, T.N. Srinivasan, like all these people are, quite independent-minded. Amartya Sen, all these people are quite independent-minded, but when they go abroad, in some ways, those ideas are only reinforced because who do they study with? They study with, or they interact with people like Ragnar Frisch, with Jan Tinbergen, with Joan Robinson, with Galbraith. So in some ways, these are not idiosyncratic figures. These are some of the titans of the field at the time. And so that's why I'd say that I think there's much less justification for you not having been taught the two sides of the socialist calculation debate in the 1990s, as opposed to the 1950s, it being much more of that being the sort of median opinion. That's the sense that I get from my reading.
No, I agree with you. So yes, by the turn of the century, laissez-faire was gone. By 1950s, planning was very much mainstream, especially for, developing countries where import substitution and a somewhat planned economy was the thing to do. Only developed countries should have free trade models and so on. So that's clear. But none of these people would have been called anti-national or extremist in the departments there. So that's what I was alluding to when I said groupthink. It was more that in India, if you were a little bit off this kind of median opinion, you would immediately suspect either not good enough or to be sidelined or just, plain anti-nationalist. Whereas none of the people who were away from the mainstream abroad, even the Indian economists who moved there and then, sort of moved on to other things, none of them would be called anti-national or any particular personal intention would be attributed to their intellectual thinking in a way that happened in India. And that seems to be a trend even today, right? You don't support the government development model and you're now anti-national. And we are no longer in a world where we don't have any private colleges. So there's something going on in India where this seems to be a very long-term trend.
No, it certainly is an affliction that Indians suffer. And I hope that we find a cure for it. But I don't know if it's necessarily an exclusively Indian thing. I mean, I don't know if that should make us feel happy or sad. But for example, in the same time, in the 1950s, McCarthyism is rife in the United States, right? And so you have, Hollywood producers, you have actors, anybody who has anything, who's ever attended any sort of socialist or social democratic event is branded a communist and anti-national as a traitor and is targeted by the House of Un-American Activities by McCarthy. So in some ways, you have literally, they are being called traitors. I was just, at the archives the last few days looking at the Vijay Lakshmi Pandit papers, who was then the ambassador in Washington. And she talks about this mania. She's saying many of her friends are being accused and being hauled up in front of these committees. And she's like, we hang out with these people. They're not communists. Like we're fighting communists at home. These are not communists. I mean, these are wealthy people, but they're being hauled up. So I don't know if it happens to professional economists, but certainly in society in general, even a free capitalist country, a sort of non-socialist capitalist country like America, I think can suffer this affliction.
One of the things, like we've talked about how this plays out in popular consciousness, but there is a very technical aspect to planning. Like it's literally like there is an arithmetic exercise on what are the total number of resources, like, how many bicycles does India need, right? So it all starts with, this is our total steel output. This is how much we can invest in heavy machinery and steel production. Now, out of this steel production, we need steel to make, glasses, and we need steel for tables and chairs, and we need steel for bicycles, and we need steel for heavy machinery. So now we're going to specifically allot, and these allotments were very specific. It's like you are allowed to make 500 bicycles this year. And if you exceed your quantity, then, the inspector would come and make you have a penalty. If you thought you had demand for more than 500 bicycles, you had to go to the Commerce Ministry and get an expansion permit. So, there is a very technical, statistical exercise, right? Which is how the professor gets involved. On the other hand, there is political decision making for any kind of economic policy that needs to be done in the country, right? And you've talked in the book about how there is this clean split that takes place between political decision making and this kind of technical expert driven decision making. And one of the things I picked up on is a consequence for India seems to be a tremendous centralization of power in the office of the Prime Minister and a sort of tremendous weakening of the cabinet. Because the way this was originally designed was that the Planning Commission became so important that every single ministry had to actually follow the plan, right? And this goes back to the Hayekian critique, which is that you can't have plan by consensus, right? This is why Hayek says that you can't have planning in a democracy because this can't be done by consensus. You need to have a plan and everyone needs to agree to that plan because it's literally numbers that have been fixed for inputs and outputs. And in the process, and you talk about this through how you have disgruntled, finance ministers, other ministers, people are threatening to resign. Mahalanobis is writing letters about how he's feeling very dejected and disappointed about how he's doing this wonderful thing and people just don't seem to get it. Is this the long-term cost we've paid in the Indian democracy and as a constitutional republic that we have become so centralized and the Prime Minister is so important? And that's been both good and bad, depending on who the Prime Minister is, of course. But we have a very weak cabinet. We don't have a British cabinet system where cabinet members now resign or don't toe the line or they can topple the government. I mean, there is something funky about Indian parliamentarians.
I think that you're right there. And I think that the planning project gets so much of its oomph from Nehru, right? The fact that the person who believes in this project and is willing to back it so wholeheartedly also happens to be the biggest vote getter in the country gives it this kind of legitimacy, right? So in some ways, Nehru never says it explicitly, but the final proof of the fact that when he says it is democratic is the fact that he says, well, you keep voting me into power. And his popularity is really more than that of any other person in the Congress party, certainly after Patel dies. And so the fact that he's backing these plans gives it a sort of, popular legitimacy in electoral kind, which we might question. I mean, so let me sort of try to address this in two ways. One is to just talk about a little bit more about this endeavor for statistical exactitude that a plan entails. In my book, I argue that that is what really gives a fillip to this data infrastructure, because one of the sort of side effects of that is that India needs to establish national income accounts, the Central Statistical Organization, the National Sample Survey, and that's what brings Mahalanobis to the center of policymaking in India. And I found this quote by Milton Friedman about Mahalanobis quite arresting. So Milton Friedman writes about the time that he comes to India and that he meets Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis, and he says that the professor impresses him as a person. He's a very brilliant man, but he says that there is a reason why people who are mathematically gifted at a young age tend to drift towards planning. And he says the reason is that people who are gifted in mathematics at a young age seem to require that they need to find solutions that are black and white from a very young age. And they're not willing to admit that there is any gray in between. Milton Friedman then quotes Adam Smith to say that the planner thinks of human society as a chessboard upon which the planner can move pieces, but forgets that every piece on this chessboard of humanity has its own agency. And so he says that this is a problem with a person like Mahalanobis, that he thinks that this is a problem of physics. And that's something I write about, that he does not think that there are any political trade-offs to be made. He thinks that this is entirely a problem of mathematics and physics, and you just need to find the mathematical solution to it. So there's this willingness to jettison politics in a way that I think can be sometimes dangerous. In terms of whether allowing for this kind of technocratic planning erodes political legitimacy in terms of a cabinet's power being eroded and a prime minister becoming too powerful, I think that under Nehru, there were some guardrails because Nehru was particularly deferential towards this kind of procedural democracy. And this is something that other scholars have written about, including Ramchandra Guha, Sunil Khilnani, etc., that because he knew that he was the first prime minister, he put a lot of attention to, for example, turning up to parliament, sitting during opposition leaders' speeches, responding to their questions, etc. And so there was some deference to other members of the cabinet. Yet, as you point out, or perhaps as you were alluding to, India's finance minister, John Mathai, resigns, saying that the planning commission has become a super cabinet and that it is superseding the decisions of the cabinet. But on the other hand, you do see that especially after the relative failure of the second five-year plan, you do see in some ways the sort of antibodies in the system acting up. You do see, even within the Planning Commission, people like V.T. Krishnamachari, the Deputy Chairman, Tarlok Singh, the Secretary of the Planning Commission, pushing back against Mahalanobis. You see the finance ministry, especially, always being in a tussle with the planning commission. This is something that causes Mahalanobis real angst. He's writing to Nehru saying that, I'm going to resign if this continues, especially under finance ministers like T.T. Krishnamacharya, who do not believe in as powerful a planning commission. After him, under Ashok Mehta, after Nehru dies, who makes quite significant changes to the powers of the planning commission, under Morarji Desai, another finance minister who is not really so keen on the planning commission being this powerful, under Lal Bahadur Shastri, the prime minister that in some ways Nehru had sort of handpicked as his successor. Again, the planning commission's powers are trimmed. And you see this in a variety of ways, and I won't go into the details in which the planning commission's powers are trimmed. And so in some ways, you are seeing other wings of the government pushing back. And I think that this push and pull is in the favor of the planning commission and somebody like Mahalanobis in its most strident phase in the early 1950s, which the first five-year plan was seen as a success, partly just because India had very good sterling balances, had very favorable monsoons and crop yields. And in the first 2 years of the second five-year plan, with the foreign exchange crunch, then after that with wars with China and with Pakistan and with two failed monsoons, things really change for the economy. And that, in a sense, becomes the opportunity for people within the planning commission and outside, such as within the cabinet and the finance ministry, to push back and to reclaim some of the powers that the planning commission had. So I think that there was, in some ways, a tussle. But you are right that when Nehru was in his pomp, he was able to push through a lot of these powers. But it was also helped by the fact that those were the most successful years of the plan in terms of just, raw economic growth. As even a critic of planning like Vivek Drebroy writes, that industrial capacity did increase substantially during this period.
Nehru's, in his first 7-8 years, economic growth is like 3.5-4%. Whereas for 40 years before that, it was 1%.
Yeah,
right?
less than 1%.
India was essentially a stagnant economy for most of the 20th century until Nehru comes to power and says we need to build this massive capacity.
Right. And as Pulapre Balakrishnan points out, if India had done a better job of stemming population growth, the real growth might have been even greater. A lot of that growth was eaten up by a very high population growth as well at the time.
Well, yes and no, because we have countries which had planning and lower population densities, which also didn't develop. I think now on this, the writing is very clear on the wall that free trade and being part of the global free trade movement does increase the size of the pie and, provides a massive amount of wealth and increase in GDP and growth. The things that are praised about planned economy is things like, they made this massive investment in universal education. They have very high female labor force participation because, communism sort of encouraged that. Or they developed good healthcare capacity and had lots of nurses or something. I mean, India failed on that count too.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Completely, that's a separate matter.
And healthcare, yeah.
Yes, that's a separate matter. That's a failure in the kind of plan that India pursued. But in terms of GDP growth, right, the difference between the free trade economies and, the import substitution / varying degrees of plan economies, it is just startling. And, the moment China liberalizes and India liberalizes, given what you can do when you have a very large population, if you actually unleash private enterprise, even domestic markets, right, not just international trade, I mean, that was the game changer.
But I'm actually curious to know what you'd say about this this debate that sometimes comes up about within different types of planning regimes between import substitution and export-led planning regimes like, say, South Korea in the 1960s and 70s that, Vivek Chibber, Atul Kohli have written about, or even planning regimes that become export-led like China from the 1980s onwards, right? So do we point then at planning or the kind of planning that is adopted?
Both. I'll elaborate a bit. So a lot of people have talked about how Korea was actually, there was industrial targeting and there was some state-led development. On this, curiously enough, like whether it's Anne Kruger or Arvind Panagaria, the trade economists who've gone through the empirical evidence, lots of people at the World Bank, they show that the industrial targeting that Korea did, those industries never really took off, and most of the industries that did take off are not the ones that the state was heavily subsidizing and, paying attention to. So, for instance, there's a point in time when in South Korea, their biggest export is human hair. And that is not something that the government is targeting as a heavy machinery growth. There are very few successes of industrial planning that we've seen. Taiwanese semiconductor industry is like one of them. So, there are a few things that we can point to, but there are more failures than there are successes, at least from the empirical literature on free trade and industrial targeting. The Indian situation is slightly different in the following sense, right? Now, if you're talking about a closed economy and import substitution and very high tariffs, that is a tax on domestic consumers and foreign producers. Right? But India, in addition to that, also had this license permit system, right? And this comes directly from Mahalanobis's plan. There is a quota that each, producer is supposed to produce, and they can't cross that. There is a price control. That is a tax on the domestic producer and the domestic consumer. In the sense that you can imagine a country which didn't have this internal control system, which only had very high tariffs, but at least they did well in the domestic market, right? They didn't compete in the global market. So then when you change the tariff structure, maybe your domestic producers became competitive and then they could compete with the global producers the way it happened in Taiwan or South Korea. But in India, the domestic producers were always hobbled, right? It was always like they were running the race with one leg tied, right? Or on crutches, because there was a domestic massive tax that was imposed because of the permit raj, right? So I think that is where a very large part of the difference is. And this, of course, comes directly from the planning culture. So, they are misallocating resources, as, most critics of planning, allude to or argue is going to happen. So let's say your steel production is, X number of tons. And now, given the steel production, you have planned priorities. Heavy industry is going to get so much. You can only produce, say, 2,000 Bajaj scooters, right, per year. Now, we know that between population growth and between pop culture, the demand for Bajaj scooters is like 10x that, right? But you can't expand. So they keep going back to the government. The government doesn't give them an expansion permit. Like, all this is a matter of record. So what happens? The price of Bajaj scooters starts increasing, right? But the government cannot allow a capitalist to profit from a shortage that was created by the plan in the first place. So then what comes after that? Price controls. Right? So the price controls are a natural consequence of the quantity controls, which are a natural consequence of planning exactly, how many tons of steel you're going to produce in the economy and so on and so forth. And now that you've restricted both price and quantity, there is no way that if you suddenly opened up the economy and liberalized and opened it up to the world, overnight, these industries are going to be able to compete with the rest of the world because they've never quite developed the capacity to do so. So I think this was one major difference. The other major difference is India punished small-scale industries and cottage industries by having that crazy reservation list, right? There were certain cottage industries that were only reserved to be small. So there was no incentive for any capital investment to enter those industries, or because you couldn't scale and you couldn't really profit, which means India never quite developed, textile, leather, shoe manufacturing, the sorts of things that you saw coming out of the rest of the Asian economies. So I think you are right in that, yes, is it just any planning or is it the Indian kind of planning? I think most planning will hurt GDP growth, in some shape or form. But the version that India pursued, that converted into this license permit raj, it just really devastated and imposed a massive tax on Indian private enterprise. I don't know if that answers your question, but so that's how I think about that.
That's very helpful. And as the historian, what I found very interesting about planning is that I think the common assumption is that Indian industrialists at all times would have opposed planning. But again, you go back to the 1930s. In 1934...
No, they would support it. It benefits them.
Exactly. And so I think that this is something that maybe like your listeners don't know, that in 1934, G.D. Birla, one of India's foremost capitalists, is making a plea for planning at the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, saying that we need to have the state involved. In 1944, Birla, J.R.D. Tata, Lala Shriram, etc., fund the publication of the Bombay Plan, which is again sort of less sort of socialistic than the Congress's planning, but it still has the state sort of owning large swaths of the industrial setup and curiously and very self-interestedly protects it from foreign competition. Right. And so in some ways, in the 40s and 50s at least, it served the industrialists to have first movers advantage and not have to compete with any outsider and therefore basically be inefficient and yet very profitable.
Yes. And, they really feel the bite only when Indira Gandhi comes in.
Exactly.
And
this
then,
is something that
willy-nilly starts nationalizing stuff.
Yeah, the license permit raj really locks in the 70s onwards. Or the late 60s, maybe, when bank nationalization happens, LIC gets nationalized, all these other things happen. That's when I think what you're saying, which is that
there's a lot of discretion, right? You can literally lose your entire life's work overnight, as it happens with banks and so on. So I think there is some change of mind. But even today, like I was having this conversation on the podcast with Naushad Forbes, who's written this wonderful book, and he was leading CII at one point in time. And even now, Indian industry is extremely protectionist because it benefits them. And I constantly ask him, why aren't they saying, hey, we need to liberalize, we need to build ports, we need to have better infrastructure, so that we can be more competitive with the global system rather than asking for these imports? And he said, that's way harder. It's just easier to ask for tariffs. That's like a much easier ask. And then, that of course imposes a huge tax on the Indian consumer, especially the poorest people, right? Because things are getting more expensive.
If I may just go back to a certain earlier question that you'd asked, which I didn't answer, but I wanted to, which is the connection between this sort of supercharging of prime ministerial power, under planning, and where it leads us today with the PMO that's also extremely, confident and extremely powerful. I think that you're right that in some ways there is this parallel, though Modi and Nehru would hate the comparison, that they do sort of mirror each other in terms of being very powerful prime ministers. Perhaps only Indira Gandhi in between is a similar person. But I think the difference, ironically, is that under Nehru, there is a deference, some might argue an excessive deference towards technocracy, whereas it's the opposite today. And it's not to say that the deference to technocracy always leads to good results, because as you've argued that, that planning had, many issues, but it is within the mainstream of what economists think. Whereas something like demonetization is the opposite of that, right? And so it's something that almost no professional economist is willing to put their name endorsing. It's something that is seen. So you can have very powerful prime ministers, but with very different impulses with regard to technocracy.
True. I think even Indira Gandhi was probably not to the same extreme as Modi, where there seems to be a suspicion of experts and technocrats. But with Indira Gandhi, she just thought they were dispensable,
exactly.
right? If this guy is not doing my bidding, the next guy. Yeah, so I think Nehru had a genuine regard for certain kinds of expertise. I think that's a personal trait. But it's curious you mentioned Modi and demonetization. I have written about Modi in newspaper columns, and the way I described him is using that exact Adam Smith quote that you just gave from Milton Friedman, which is, things like demonetization, things like a botched up, initial GST. These things suggest that he very much thinks of individuals as, chess pieces that can be moved around, the COVID crazy lockdown announcement. These are things that they're very technocratic in a sense that, it's all coming from one person's mind, and they think that individuals don't have agency. They're going to behave in this very robotic or very inanimate way. And I think that is something that is very common, maybe not between Nehru and Modi, but certainly between Mahalanobis and Modi, which is another parallel most people would not draw. But I think that is definitely a parallel that I see. But of course, you're right. There's a tremendous, divergence on where the expert advice comes from. And, in one sense, we were talking earlier about how there's political decision-making and technical decision-making, right? Or economic decision-making by policymakers. And Nehru and Mahalanobis were on one extreme of that. And it almost feels like the pendulum is on the other extreme when it comes to Modi, right? Here it's like, okay, there is really just no room for technical expertise. Look at how they botched up everything in the past and they created central plans or whatever it is that, the current dispensation is suspicious of and against.
Right?
There's a suspicion of it.
Of expertise and experts as a class. Because part of this kind of right-wing populist movement, I think, across the world is that these technocrats and these experts belong to a certain privileged group, which they often are, and that they have led us astray. And therefore, in a sense, targeting them becomes a way of buffing your populist credential, of showing that you're with the people.
Yes and no, in the following sense, that when it suits them, they also like to allude to experts, except that they are their own experts.
Right, yeah.
Right? So I do think that what's going on, and I could be wrong, is that they don't want experts to be above the political decision-making. They want the experts to be deferential to the political decision-making. Whereas when it came to economic planning and many other parts of the economy, like, let's say the space program or something like that, the view was always, hey, the experts know what they're doing. Our job is just to allot the budgets or to provide the plan priorities or something like that. Like, we are not the people who are actually going to be building this out. So I think that is a major switch, because if we look at it, I mean, now there is a generation of right-wing historians, and a battle is being fought in the Supreme Court sometimes on these things, right?
Right, yeah.
There is a race to credential people who are saying the things that they would like, right? And I think there is a bigger backlash against credentialism and elitism than there is with expertise. I think that's how I see this playing out. But again, I mean, we are in the moment, so it's very difficult to judge it. Maybe 10 years from now, when we're having this conversation, we would see a completely different pattern, and I would go another way.
Yeah, and I think that in some ways it is good to question expertise. It is good to question credentialism and just having fancy degrees, etc. But I wish that critique would then go to, well, let's make, instead of all this knowledge being held by this narrow class, let's actually invest in public education such that everyone can potentially be, an Amartya Sen or Jagdish Bhagwati. Instead, it is that we need to sort of dismiss all of that and that entire culture and have our own people. Right. So there would be another way in which you could sort of say that this should be a moment in which, yes, upper caste elite people have dominated these positions. And so we need to have pathways for other people to be, the next, Mahalanobis or the next Manmohan Singh. And that would never be said by this government, but the next sort of rock star economist or whatever. But I think that instead it has become that all people with those signs of credentials are seen as suspect. And unless we have our own cadre of people that go through these institutions, only then can we trust them. And I think that you're right.
Again,
also,
yes and no. I think because it also depends on to what end, right? So for instance, I agree with you that we need to have policy that is based on a lot more consultation and, consensus through the democratic process. But on the other hand, should there be a democratic process to figure out what inflation we need to target? Like, absolutely not, right?
What I meant by democratizing was not that you have an RBI governor who does not have expertise.
No, but I'm saying that's what they mean. I'm not saying that's what you mean. Yeah.
Instead of what they're doing, it could be that you democratize it such that hundreds of millions of Indians are able to be in positions such that they have excellent PhDs in trade policy and monetary policy, such that you have a candidate list of hundreds, as opposed to having to cherry pick from,
And my suspicion is, even if we have that fantastic list of homegrown Manmohan Singhs and homegrown sort of, Raghu Rajans and Viralacharyas, if they are for a more independent RBI and for trimming the sort of spending problem that the finance ministry has and so on, they would not pick those experts. So I think it's very much a question of the experts need to be deferential to the political decision making, which doesn't always work well in a system where we like checks and balances, right? Where we like an independent judiciary, where we like an independent central bank, where we like the cabinet to push back on the power of the prime minister, or we like, a bicameral legislature to hold the cabinet in check. I think that's where I see this fundamental tension. And India, on all margins, is just moving further towards centripetalism, right? We set the stage for this very early on with the British government where, they pretended like 300 people could rule the entire country, and it was centripetal for a reason because everything was being run by Whitehall. And we seem to have continued that. And now, of course, the groups that wish to weaponize it and capitalize on it are always going to do it. We've had Indira Gandhi do it. We have a new moment when Narendra Modi's government is going in that very similar way. But whether it's the Finance Commission, I can think of so many Indian institutions where this is a problem, like fiscal policy and recommendations. It's a very technical question. It actually does require calculations, maybe not like Mahalanobis, but quite similar. And, then it's a very my guy versus your guy. So these are the things
the National Sample Survey is another example, right?
Yes. So I actually really want to get to that, because if we complete the conversation without talking about the National Sample Survey, when it comes to this book, I think, the readers are just going to kill me, right? So you've kind of, again, talked about the sample survey as this wonderful merging of India being on the brink of world-class expertise, right? Like, PC Mahalanobis has been invited to be one of the Royal Fellows, right? He's not just writing the second 5-year plan. He's one of the foremost statisticians in the world, is very, very well regarded. And he's simultaneously been drafted into this nation-building project, in the 40s by Nehru when the Congress is working towards, a post-colonial moment. And the National Sample Survey is bang, at the center of this whole thing unfolding. So Can you walk us through why is that so important to the development planning system? Other than, of course, the fact that we do need numbers, but more generally than that, what is going on with the NSS surveys? When I was reading those sections, it's very reminiscent of, like I said, Sukumar Sen setting up India as a democracy, right? Like, it's literally these surveyors, there's so few of them. They can't have sampling error. It's a massive country with 450 million people. And they are also, like Sukumar Sen, traveling by elephant to these far-flung places to actually get a sense of what people are eating and, formulating the questions. And it's the best in the world. It's emulated by everyone else. Even modern-day UN, World Bank figures, everything we get from Africa, they're based on the sample surveys that Mahalanobis set up, right? So what is it about the national sample surveys that are so important for the Indian democratic and nation-building exercise?
Yeah, I think that, so the National Sample Survey in some ways I think crystallizes the different ways in which Mahalanobis was plugged into Indian nation building from the 1950s onwards. So as you said, Mahalanobis, I think that we almost remember him too much for the second five-year plan. If he never had anything to do with Indian planning, he would still be, I think, known as one of India's foremost scientists of that period. He was, right? He was only
I think he would be more revered, actually, because the second five-year plan was the disaster.
Yeah. So he was the 11th Indian to be inducted into the Royal Society in England. The other people, including Srinivasa Ramanujan, some India's most famous scientists.
Also his contemporary.
Exactly. Also his contemporary. He used to go on long walks on Sundays in Cambridge with Srinivasa Ramanujan. And so he was one of the foremost scientists of India, one of the foremost statisticians in the world. Edward Deming, one of the great statisticians of the 20th century, says that no statistician ever had as much influence on the profession as Mahalanobis did. He is behind India's national income accounts. He is behind the setting up of the Central Statistical Organization. He runs the National Sample Survey. He sets up ISI in 1931. He made Sankhya, their journal, a world-leading journal in statistics in 1933.
Which is based on Biometrica, which is Carl Pearson's journal that he gets inspired by.
And when the UN decides to have a statistical commission, he's part of the first meetings about it. In the 1950s, he's the chairperson of the UN Statistical Commission numerous times, nominated both by the USSR and by the Americans, right? So he's just considered across the board as one of the leading people in this. He is, as Angus Deaton says, where Mahalanobis and India led, the rest of the world has followed, right? So even till today, Nobel Prize-winning economists acknowledge that Mahalanobis played this very pioneering role. So that is one aspect of Mahalanobis' or the professor's career. And I think that the question for many has been, how does he go from statistics to economic policy? And one argument that's been advanced is that it's all down to a friendship with Nehru. And I find that a really unconvincing explanation. Because firstly, as someone who's spent a lot of time reading through his papers, he's not someone who has many personal friends. And of the acquaintances he knows many economists. So why doesn't he just get a regular economist to be...
Arthur Lok Singh, who he's so close to, right? Who also is part of the first five-year plan and so on.
Yeah. The thing with Mahalanobis is that he has this eminence in a domain, in a scientific domain that comes to be seen as essential for centralized planning. And this becomes clear from the late 1930s onwards. It's recognized by Bose. It's recognized by other members of the National Planning Committee from the late 1930s onwards. It's why when Nehru meets with Mahalanobis in the 1940s, he is meeting Mahalanobis after having got complaints from many members of the National Planning Committee that, we have to write these reports on different aspects of India's economy and we are in the dark. We have no data on this. And so in some ways, Mahalanobis steps in at the opportune moment. And so it's the meeting of an extremely ambitious and industrious personality with a moment...
An institution builder.
An institution builder as well. That's very important. Yeah. And someone who's built this institution at a time when India has very few homegrown institutions that are seen as having international eminence, genuinely seen as a place where people would come to learn cutting-edge techniques on large-scale sample surveying. At a time when India doesn't have very much of that, this is a person who's built it with very little government help, right? And so is seen as somebody who can do these things, quite amazing things. And so I think it's the merging of this moment where an institution builder and a person with domain expertise meets a rising acknowledgement that centralized statistics will be important for any kind of centralized planning. And I think that that's what leads to him becoming a part of the Planning Commission.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm not big on these people were friends and, Nehru liked Lasky and G.B. Shaw, so India went Fabian. I think these are great stories we like as folklore, but they're not very sensible analytical explanations. Why India turned Fabian has a much deeper history. Why, Mahalanobis became as important for the Indian economic, policy making sort of world, I think you're completely right on the structural explanation. Another thing I would add is the British government. I mean, now we know that in addition to the extractive policies, there was just a hopeless level of neglect, right, when it came to local investments. And we know now from the economics literature that there's a difference between British-run parts of India versus those that were run by the monarchs. Also, the difference between, say, zamindari areas and Rayotwari areas where, the British are setting up their own local offices to collect tax revenue. There's better data collection. Even till modern day, there's better state capacity, from something that was set up 200 years ago.
My colleague at Notre Dame, Lakshmi Iyer, has...
exactly. Lakshmi Iyer is the pioneer on that paper, and Abhijit Banerjee, of course. So I find that this also sort of coincides with the 40s and, in a sense, the Bengal famine. There's literally no data on how many people are starving. How much food are we producing? How does it need to be directed? Can we afford to export this food, right? And in a sense, I feel like that meeting the nationalist, movement in terms of there's this extraction, there's this oppression of people, with the fact that there is just this ridiculous level of disregard for, local state capacity building and investment. Because if you build the state capacity, it can collect the data. Then it's a question of collating it. But that's completely missing in India. And it seems like that went hand in hand with the needs of, the planning exercise, which comes much later. So I feel like your structural explanation not just, makes sense for the Nehru-Mahalanobis interaction, but it also fits in quite well in the longer arc of history, if you think about it from the early 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the Bengal famine, I think very often we sort of overlook that and how traumatic. The estimates are, up to 1 million or more people die, right? In some ways, it's kind of a forgotten Holocaust because it's not done by violence, though. I mean, there's arguments about, how much the British could have averted that. And certainly we know about Churchill's, extremely insensitive attitude towards dying Indian peasants. And Mahalanobis lives through this, right? The Indian Statistical Institute, all of the people there are seeing people dying at their doorstep.
Yeah. And they're starving themselves.
Exactly,
like they're all struggling.
Right.
Their family members are struggling.
Right. And yet at the time, when India is becoming independent, there are people like Nehru are talking about the fact that we cannot have a Bengal famine again. And we do not know whether our Grow More Food campaign is working or not. We don't know if it's a success because we don't have enough data. We do not have a national sample survey to know if our Grow More Food campaign is a success or is it a failure. And so I think that this need for data is something, especially relating to hunger, something that Benjamin Siegel has written about in his book, and something that, of course, Amartya Sen writes about in terms of, famines and there not being famines in a democracy. But part of it is also a democracy that's investing in building up capacity such that you can actually track what the levels of hunger are. And so I think that is a moment that is important to someone, to the ISI, to Mahalanobis, to seeing the relevance and the importance of knowing, for example, what the average consumption of an Indian is in the rural areas, calorie consumption in rural areas versus urban areas, what the productivity of and yield per acre in different parts of the country are. And as you said, the National Sample Survey suddenly makes possible something that was seemed as a gargantuan task that might have been impossible, right? Harold Hotelling, an American statistician, says that there's no way that you can do this kind of national sample survey in India. It's too big, it's too complex. We don't even attempt it in the United States with all our capacity. How can you do it? And I write about how Mahalanobis writes in his diary about how the institute is understaffed. There are 15 different languages from which it has to be standardized back to English. There are over 100 different systems of measurement across India that have to be standardized. People are falling ill due to tropical diseases when they go. They have to be accompanied by armed guards through forests. They have to wait for the snow to melt in Himalayan passes. They encounter tribals and they're supposed to sort of ask them about, these employment and productivity. And they said that these tribals don't even understand the language that we speak in. Some people quit the ISI and don't want to work for the National Sample Survey because they're worried about man-eating tigers in these places that they're serving. So it really is a colossal task.
But the other thing you also highlight is the innovation, right? I mean, he literally finds a way to sample without bias. I mean, minimizing bias and error, because that's the entire difference between census and sampling, right? And people preferred census because sampling was so error-prone and so biased, and you could get systemic biases. And Mahalanobis is the first statistician across the world who comes up with a way where we can actually find a way to sample that will come close to census, but at a fraction of the cost. And I think that's just, at the innovation level, I mean, the fact that he was an institutional builder and he could execute and he was entrepreneurial, of course, those are wonderful things. But even just coming up with the design, I think is incredible for that time. I mean, he's really up there with C.V. Raman and Ramanujan and all the world-class sort of, Indian scientists.
And it's not just a contribution, as you said, to Indian social science and to Indian, capacity building, but as you said, he literally writes the textbook on sample surveying for the UN Subcommission on Sample Surveying. He heads it, of course. He's one of the primary moving forces for, a decade and a half. He writes the textbook that is used by other countries on how to conduct these large-scale sample surveys at a fraction of the cost that plot-to-plot enumeration would cost. It's adopted, as you said, by the UN and the World Bank. Till today, there are sample surveys conducted which essentially borrow from what the ISI sets up in the 1940s and 50s. So it really is a bright spot in post-colonial science and in a contribution of a developing country to global development practice. And I think that that's why it's particularly troubling that in the last few years, you've had reporting by statistical journalists like Pramit Bhattacharya, but also economists, from Jean Drèze and Arvind Subramaniam to Raghuram Raj and Kaushal Basu. Yeah, that when there are national sample survey data that happens to show a 40-year high in unemployment, it happens to be suppressed. When there happens to be a report that shows that, household consumption has decreased at a precipitous rate, that survey is just discontinued. And it's why, the Economist had a headline a few months earlier saying that India's once vaunted statistical system is crumbling today. And I think that regardless of your political position and your views you have on the economy, this is something that would be useful regardless of political persuasion. And I think it's a real crying shame.
You're right. On one thing, I think Mahalanobis must be lauded because even our ability to criticize the second 5-year plan comes from the availability of good data and measurement and the fact that we could say, hey, you said, the size of the pie will grow and GDP will grow and we're going to have, X amount of increase in food grain production, and none of that happened and you really screwed up, right? And we could not have done that if we didn't have this statistical infrastructure. So, even to critique Mahalanobis's planning venture, we need Mahalanobis's statistical venture, is the way I think when I think how history should evaluate him. And I think now that has completely crumbled. But I have a different question for you in terms of, thinking about these things in a longer arc rather than just the present moment. Are we just doomed in a sense that, this kind of big data, when it comes to the government being in charge of it, is always going to be weaponized? I mean that in the sense of, when it came to planning, especially, the later years, Indira Gandhi and so on, I mean, they were literally weaponizing planned inputs and outputs to, extract bribes from, various entrepreneurs, regular folks, to impose draconian limits, sometimes draconian limits on newsprint so that, they can curtail free speech of newspapers and so on. Now it's a different version. Now it is being weaponized so that the government cannot be critiqued, right? It's taken a different flavor. If we extend this analogy away from, NSS statistics and planning and we move into Aadhaar and, the National Population Register and the two combined with the CAA, which is like a terrifying thought in itself, it's going to be weaponized in a completely different way on the question of citizenship and things like that. So is this, going back to someone like James C. Scott and, his book, Seeing Like a State, are we just doomed? Are these state-led big data, technocratic exercises always going to be weaponized in some shape or form? And we should just, think about private data collection like Rukmini, Srinivasan, another data journalist, has been talking about how we need something like the Pew survey. And, we need to come up with excellent sort of decentralized private initiatives, both for profit and non-profit, to start thinking through these things.
I'd agree. I think that pluralizing data collection is definitely, I would think, is an unalloyed good. I think that it's good to have different data sets produced by different organizations of, whether state or non-state, and have an ability to cross-check, right? And not to rely overwhelmingly on just the state. I'd say that the situation in the 1950s is different because there is no other alternative. It is only the state. You're going not from having one data set or choosing between them. It's just going from a completely disaggregated data set that the colonial architecture leaves you to trying to create one. And so I don't know if we are always doomed, but I think that we always need to be vigilant. I think that there's always a drift towards this kind of malevolent use. And I think that we always need to be hyper vigilant. And so in the 1950s, I mean, yes, one should always be concerned about a state that commands this kind of data about its citizens. But on the other hand, in the 1950s, the reason that this data is being extracted or in a sense being unfurled is because the state wants to discern the lives of the citizens in order that some sort of development be embarked upon. Right? Again, through which policies we can debate whether good or bad. But even if you wanted to have more export-led or more free trade-based growth, having the NSS data would still be useful, right? And of course, also the data that you had in the 50s, 60s, and even 70s is nowhere near the kind of data that you have today. The amount of data and the ability to aggregate the data and crunch that.
And computing power.
Exactly.
Right? It's not like Mahalanobis where a basic computer occupied an entire room and he had to write letters to get
India
it.
had two computers at the end of the 1950s, both brought by Mahalanobis, one of his other achievements. But
my phone is more powerful than, each of those computers at this point.
Those computers, the UNIVAC from America cost $1 million and $200,000 every year for upkeep. And, has less computing power than what we carry in our pockets today. And so I think that it's information and data gathering and data computing and analysis of a different order of magnitude then versus today. But even in the 1970s, you can see how a state that turns malevolent can use data for nefarious purposes, right? So in some ways, there's no way to protect data, if that is the only data you rely on, from the depredations of the state in that kind of way, which is why pluralizing data sources might be a good thing. Where you don't have freedom of press, nor do you have alternate data sources or data sets. And so it puts social scientists in a bind about what to believe and what not to believe. But I think that even with the free press, I think that as a citizenry, we need to be vigilant, and also with our political choices in terms of asking, especially with things like Aadhaar, and these are the questions that have come up, which is that to what use is the data being put? Who has control over the data? Is that transparent? Who has access to the data aside from the government? Other vendors, third parties? Is it being sold? How is it being maintained? What is the sort of protections and the firewalls that I have? And perhaps most realistically, and this is something I think that most Indians are realizing today and growing by the day, is that do you have an option to opt out? Right? With the National Sample Survey, you could just say, I don't answer your questions.
Same with the census. You could just refuse to answer the question.
But with the Aadhaar, as anyone who lives in India knows today, it's becoming increasingly difficult to not have an Aadhaar, though there is no law that says that everybody
can't get into national archives without it.
Yeah. When it was promulgated, it was suggested as that this would just be one more identity card. It'll just be the best amongst them. But now it's becoming the primary method. And that having a driver's license, having a PAN card, having a voter ID card put together now, if you go to a bank to open an account, all of that, three of them put together equals one Aadhaar card, right? So you are getting into a system where there is a form of identity that has all kinds of biometric information and much more sensitive information than my PAN card has, and you do not have the ability to opt out of it. And I think that those are some of the dangers.
No, I think I agree with you that there is huge value even now in systematic government statistical, data sets being put out, and the need to be vigilant, with sort of plural sources of data. You've been so generous with your time. Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Shruti. This was a real pleasure.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.